It was supposed to be just another quiet morning in southern Taiwan, the kind of humid dawn where the air feels heavy and the city wakes slowly under a pale orange sky. But on November 12, 2025, that calm didn't last. Within minutes, the horizon darkened. The wind began to roar and the world turned upside down. Typhoon Fung-Wong, one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in the western Pacific, slammed into Kaohsiung with a force that no one alive had ever seen before. Winds screamed past 145 miles per hour, gusting close to 175, bending skyscrapers, tearing billboards from towers and throwing cars through the streets like toys. Waves higher than 25 feet crushed the city's port-shattering piers and sending tankers drifting inland. By sunrise, the streets were gone, replaced by torrents of brown debris-filled water rushing through neighborhoods that hours earlier had been filled with commuters and morning markets. The lights went out, the sirens began, and an entire metropolis was swallowed by the storm. Across the Pacific, meteorologists called it the storm of the decade. But for the people of Kaohsiung, it wasn't a statistic. It was survival. Families trapped on rooftops, hospitals without power, and first responders fighting a losing battle against nature's full rage. And as the skies unleashed their fury, one truth became clear. This wasn't just a storm, it was a warning. Just after dawn on November 12, 2025, Typhoon Fung-Wong roared ashore near Kaohsiung, a bustling port city of nearly 3 million people, and within minutes it became a nightmare. The storm hit with 145-mile-per-hour winds gusting near 175, transforming the skyline into a battleground of steel glass and flying debris. The first strike came from the sea. Waves as tall as 25 feet slammed into the harbor, crushing fishing boats, tossing shipping containers onto the streets, and flooding the port terminals. Kaohsiung International Airport shut down as floodwaters swallowed its runways, stranding hundreds of travelers in total darkness after the backup generators failed. Then came the wind. Transformers exploded in showers of blue sparks. Traffic lights dangled by their wires. Power poles snapped and fell like matchsticks. Within 2 hours, more than 120,000 houses and homes lost power as the grid collapsed under the weight of wind and water. The storm surge raced inland, flooding the downtown district and surging up through sewers, manholes, and basement levels with terrifying speed. The Love River, a symbol of Kaohsiung's beauty, turned into a monster, breaking its banks and sweeping cars, trash bins, and entire kiosks into the current. Sidewalks cracked. Glass windows blew out of high-rises, raining shards onto cars below. In the city's port zone, warehouses and cranes toppled, metal bending and screaming under the relentless force of the wind. By 8:00 a.m., downtown, Kaohsiung was unrecognizable. Streets had vanished beneath 6 feet of floodwater, and the air was filled with the sound of collapsing structures and alarms wailing in the storm. Firefighters struggled to move through chest-deep currents, pulling people from cars and rescuing the elderly trapped inside flooded buildings. And yet in those first chaotic hours, no one could fully grasp what was happening. It wasn't just rain. It wasn't just another typhoon. It was nature unleashed, a city's entire infrastructure being torn apart in real time. By mid-morning, Kaohsiung was no longer a city. It was a sea. The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering rooftops, bursting drains, and turning every street into a rushing current. In less than 24 hours, over 20 inches of rain had fallen, a record-breaking total that overwhelmed every flood control system in place. The pumps failed, the rivers rose, and the city sank. In neighborhoods like Zuoying-Fengshan and Tianjin, entire blocks vanished beneath the water. Cars floated like paper boats, colliding with power poles and storefronts. The glow of neon signs shimmered under the floodwaters before flickering out one by one. Sidewalks disappeared. Intersections became whirlpools of debris tires, roof tiles, even refrigerators carried by the current. The Love River, once the heart of Kaohsiung's beauty, had become its greatest threat. It spilled over its banks and merged with storm drains, creating one continuous tide that swallowed everything in its path. In the port district, shipping cranes collapsed and ferries broke loose from their moorings, drifting through the streets where buses used to run. The roar of the storm mixed with the sound of crashing metal and distant cries for help. Families huddled on rooftops, waving flashlights and towels to signal helicopters circling above. Parents carried children on their shoulders, wading through waist-deep water that smelled of oil sewage and salt. In some places, the flood reached the second floor of buildings, trapping residents inside as doors jammed and stairwells filled with muddy water. On social media, desperate pleas flooded the internet. Videos of submerged cars of elderly residents, stranded in wheelchairs of rescue boats, struggling to stay upright in the current. A man's trembling voice could be heard over the wind. "We can't get out." The waters at the windows. Meanwhile, the outer edges of the city faced a new terror. In the mountainous areas of Maolin and Nemesia, torrential rains unleashed massive landslides, burying homes and cutting off entire villages. Roads disappeared into ravines. Rescue teams tried to reach them, but bridges were gone and the mud kept coming down. By noon, the city's skyline was blurred by rain and mist. The boundaries between river, land, and sea no longer existed. Kaohsiung was drowning, and the storm was only getting stronger. By early afternoon, Kaohsiung had turned into a war zone, not of soldiers, but of survivors. The wind still screamed through the streets, bending trees sideways and whipping sheets of rain that stung like glass. The city's emergency sirens wailed above the chaos, but most people couldn't hear them over the roar of the storm. It was no longer about property. It was about survival. The Taiwanese military and fire departments launched a full-scale rescue operation, one of the largest in the island's history. Black Hawk helicopters circled above the city, their searchlights cutting through the gray mist as soldiers rappelled onto rooftops to pull families to safety. From the air, Kaohsiung looked less like a metropolis and more like a broken coastline, entire districts submerged under brown, swirling water. Down below, the struggle was relentless. Rescue boats fought powerful currents, dodging floating cars, tangled wires, and fallen street signs. Firefighters and volunteers formed human chains, gripping one another as they guided children and the elderly through waist-deep floods. Every rescue was a battle, every block a fight against time. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, were running out of power. At Kaohsiung Medical University Hospital, floodwaters poured into the lower floors, forcing doctors to move patients and equipment to upper levels by flashlight. Emergency generators hummed weakly as staff carried newborns in incubators up dark stairwells. In National Chung Kung Memorial Hospital, nurses used buckets to clear water from hallways, while surgeries continued under battery-powered lamps. Across the city, that message spread like hope through the storm. Volunteers grabbed ropes, paddles, and whatever boats they could find. High school students tied plastic barrels together to build makeshift rafts. Neighbors broke through walls to reach trapped families next door. Even as the water rose and night began to fall, people refused to give up. By sunset, over 12,000 people had been rescued or evacuated. Temporary shelters filled gymnasiums and churches where strangers shared blankets, flashlights, and stories. A sense of unity, quiet but unbreakable, took root in the darkness. The storm was still raging. The water was still rising. But Kaohsiung was fighting back not with power or machinery, but with courage. And that courage in the middle of chaos became the only light left in the storm. As the eye of Typhoon Fung-Wong moved north, the storm's rage didn't fade, it expanded. What began as a direct hit on Kaohsiung evolved into a region-wide catastrophe, stretching across Chiayi, Tainan, and Pingtung. Each city faced its own disaster, and each was swallowed in a different way. In Yilan County, the Puzi River overflowed with such speed that entire villages vanished in minutes. The water tore through rice fields, uprooted banana groves, and flooded every road in sight. Farmers stood helpless as months of labor washed away in muddy torrents. Pickup trucks and tractors were swept downriver, slamming into bridges that cracked under the pressure. By afternoon, 6 feet of water blanketed the farmland, a sea of brown stretching to the horizon. Farther south in Pingtung, the Gyeoping River burst through its levees, carving new channels across neighborhoods that had never seen water this high. Streets that had once led to schools and markets now ended in swirling currents of debris. In Meja and Wutai, heavy rainfall triggered landslides that buried roads and entire clusters of homes beneath walls of mud. Rescue crews worked through the night, digging by hand, their floodlights flickering through the haze. Meanwhile, Tainan's coastline faced the storm's most brutal weapon, the sea itself. A 26-foot storm surge pounded the shoreline, tearing apart harbors and tossing fishing boats like matchsticks. The historic Anping Harbor, a landmark of Taiwan's maritime past, was ripped open by waves, while the iconic Anping treehouse, once wrapped in tranquil vines, stood half-drowned in brackish water. Coastal residents fled inland, carrying children, pets, and what little they could save. Infrastructure across southern Taiwan lay in ruins. The high-speed rail network was shut down after debris shattered power lines. National Highway 1, the country's busiest expressway, was impassable. Bridges, collapsed tunnels flooded, and entire sections of asphalt peeled away. Airports in Kaohsiung and Tainan were underwater, their runways reflecting lightning like mirrors. Communication towers fell, silencing radio signals and cutting off entire towns from emergency contact. And yet, amid the destruction, stories of heroism and unity began to surface. In Yujing, a rural town in Tainan, locals linked hands to form rescue chains, guiding one another across rushing floodwater. In Donggang, fishermen tied their boats together to create floating bridges so families could reach safety. Churches, schools, and temples became shelters where volunteers cooked for hundreds and handed out warm blankets to strangers. By midnight, meteorologists confirmed what Taiwan already knew. Fung-Wong was one of the most powerful and destructive typhoons ever to strike the island's south. Tens of thousands were homeless. Farmlands were gone, and the economy had taken a staggering hit. But through the noise of wind and ruin, one thing stood clear: the people of southern Taiwan had weathered the unimaginable together. When the winds finally stopped and the rain began to fade, southern Taiwan looked like another planet. Streets that once buzzed with scooters and street vendors were buried in mud and silence. Power lines hung low over pools of standing water. Entire neighborhoods were dark, the hum of electricity replaced by the drip of rainwater from broken rooftops. At sunrise, rescue crews could finally see what they had been fighting through. Bridges twisted like paper clips, cars stacked in piles, and boats stranded miles inland. Kaohsiung's waterfront, once the pride of southern Taiwan, was a wasteland of shattered concrete and tangled steel. The city's famous night markets were gone, replaced by rows of sandbags and the smell of fuel sewage and wet earth. By morning, 600,000 people were still without power, and hundreds of roads were blocked by debris or collapsed pavement. Across Chiayi and Tainan, crops lay in ruins, rice fields, drowned orchards destroyed, and fish farms emptied by floodwater. Economists warned of losses in the hundreds of millions, but for the families who had lost everything, numbers didn't matter. What mattered was survival. The government declared a national emergency, deploying soldiers and engineers to rebuild infrastructure and restore basic services. President Tsai Ing-wen visited Kaohsiung and stood amid the wreckage, promising immediate relief and long-term recovery. "We will rebuild stronger," she said. "We will not leave anyone behind." But the heart of the recovery came from the people themselves. Students volunteered at shelters, helping the elderly find food and medicine. Fishermen used their boats to deliver supplies to isolated villages. Families shared what little they had: candles, rice, clean water. Because in the darkness, unity was the only light left. Slowly, signs of hope began to emerge. A child rescued from a rooftop smiled for the first time in days. A volunteer played guitar in a crowded gym-turned shelter. A group of engineers restored power to a hospital, and the entire building erupted in applause. The storm had broken the land, but not its people. Meteorologists called Fung-Wong a once-in-a-century event, the kind of storm that defines a generation. But for those who lived through it, it was more than that. It was proof that in a world of rising seas and shifting skies, resilience isn't found in walls or systems. It's found in people, in the hands that pull others from the water, in the courage to start again, and in the hope that tomorrow will be dry. The storm is over, but its message still echoes across the Pacific. Typhoon Fung-Wong didn't just tear through southern Taiwan, it tore through our sense of what's possible. In a single night, it turned a thriving coastal city into a sea of silence, a place where the only sound left was the heartbeat of people refusing to give up. What happened in Kaohsiung isn't just a story about wind and water. It's a story about us, about humanity standing on the front line of a changing planet. It's about families who lost everything, but still found the strength to help others. It's about strangers becoming rescuers, neighbors becoming heroes, and a nation proving that resilience is stronger than any storm. But as the floodwaters recede and the cameras move on, a question remains. How many more storms like Fung-Wong will it take before we start listening to what the planet is telling us? Every year we see storms grow stronger, rains fall harder, and coastlines shrink a little more. We can no longer call it coincidence. It's a warning written in the wind, the waves, and the water that refuses to stop rising. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or remember how fragile our world can be, don't let it fade here. Like this video to help more people see what's really happening beyond the headlines. Share it with someone who still believes these disasters are far away. Subscribe for more true stories of survival, resilience, and hope from around the world. Because every storm leaves behind a message, and the real question is, are we listening, or are we waiting for the next one to find us?